So we have to keep in mind that the Sino-Japanese War was fought primarily over who would have the most influence in Korea, Japan or China. Now, Japan, of course, won the war, and early on, as we discussed, had seized the city of Seoul and had signed a military alliance with the Korean government. And with Japanese support, the pro-Japanese forces within Korea will gain control of the government. And they're able to make a pretty good argument, especially as Japan is winning, that Korea needs to be more like Japan. And so the Korean government will launch what are called the Kabo reforms. It's a little bit complex, but basically the Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese historically talked about history in like a 60-year cycle. And each year in that 60-year cycle had a name. And that year's name for 1894 was Kabo. So it just basically means the reforms of 1894. Now, these reforms, which are launched by these pro-Japanese Koreans with the support of the Japanese, bring about massive changes. First of all, they emphasize equality before the law. Traditionally, in Korean law, people were treated differently based on whether they were yongbon or not, for example. Right? So if you were a yongbon, you had certain privileges. There were certain crimes that you would receive a lighter penalty for than if you were just a common person. Moreover, the whole legal social distinction of yongbon was gotten rid of. They said we're no longer going to divide people up into these different classes. And in particular, the big legal social distinction they got rid of was they ended slavery. Right? They ended slavery. They also got rid of the exams and made all government positions open to any man. Right? They also got rid of the exams and made government positions open to any man. And they also made changes in regards to the role of women in society. Traditionally, especially among yongbon, women should not remarry. If something happened to their husbands, a woman should not remarry. That was the idea, was to show how loyal they were to their husbands. And women who did remarry, who were yongbon, were punished. So, for example, if you were a widow who remarried and had a son, your son was not allowed to take the exams, even if you were a yongbon, and even if the son's father was a yongbon. And they get rid of that distinction and say now widows can remarry without suffering any legal problems. They also stated that government documents need to be in Korean and not Chinese. Right, so these are interesting series of laws, and this, I think, is kind of striking in many ways, the massive changes they're trying to make. And you can see that they're trying to model Korea on Japan. They're trying to make a government that's more modern, that focuses more on equality, and it's also, in a sense, more nationalistic, because it's focusing on this idea of having documents in Korean rather than Chinese. There are some problems, though, that this government faces. First of all, it's not necessarily popular. Many Koreans did not like these changes. Right? Many Koreans did not like this. One reason they didn't like this was a question of which was more important. Is it more important to maintain Korea's independence, or is civilization, this kind of radical reform, modernization, is that more important? In other words, what's our priority? Is our priority independence, or is our priority to modernize Korea? Now, ideally, these two things go together. You want to modernize Korea so it can become more independent. But if you're someone who's looking at this, and you may agree with some of these reforms, you say, you know, I may agree with some of these reforms, but I don't like the fact that Japan has to be here for us to have these reforms. And I don't like the fact that our government is basically becoming like almost, not quite, but almost a puppet of Japan. So some Koreans may agree with these reforms, but not like the fact that they're being undertaken with Japanese support, and in fact that support is necessary for them to be undertaken at all. Moreover, we have to remember that the pro-Chinese conservatives are still around. There are people within the government who have been pushed from the highest power, but who are still around, and who do not like Japan, do not want to undertake these radical reforms. In particular, one person you couldn't get rid of by, say, firing them from their office was Empress Myeongsung. Right? Officials can be pushed out, right? You can tell an official, okay, you know what, we're giving your job to someone else. And a lot of pro-Chinese officials lost their jobs, and they were given to pro-Japanese officials. But you can't fire the Empress of Korea, right? You can't fire Empress Myeongsung. So this is kind of an issue because, remember, she is really smart. She's a very savvy woman, knows what she's doing politically, and she's often able to frustrate and kind of limit these reforms. So you have this pro-Chinese kind of faction still around because you can't get rid of the queen by just, or you can't get rid of the empress by simply firing her or something like that. You can, however, get rid of the queen by killing her. And that's what the Japanese government decides to do. Consul Miura, a consul is basically a diplomatic official. So you have this Japanese diplomat in Korea, and he says, I want to get rid of this woman. She's frustrating Japanese interests in Korea. She's stopping us from reforming Korea and expanding our power into Korea. We need to get rid of her. So he basically hires a bunch of Japanese and Korean thugs. They break into the palace, find the queen, find Empress Myeongsung, and assassinate her. They cut her up with swords, drag her body to a garden in the palace, and burn it. They also kill some others in an effort to try and find her as well. So this is this very violent, very brutal attack. And this looks, it's successful. It gets rid of the queen, but because it's so nasty and brutal and cruel, it really makes the Japanese look bad on an international stage. Right? So even though they're successful, this is going to make Japan look really bad, and it's going to backfire. Rather than leading Japan to have more power in Korea, this will lead Japan to have less power in Korea, this assassination of Empress Myeongsung. Now, I know this is a bit confusing because I sometimes refer to this woman, the wife of the Korean monarch, as Queen Min, other times as Empress Myeongsung. Koreans today typically call her Empress Myeongsung. During the time she was called, typically in English sources, Queen Min. The key thing we have to emphasize, though, is that she does not actually become recognized as an empress in her lifetime. It's not till later, when the Korean king is elevated to become emperor, which we'll talk about later, that she is posthumously, after she's dead, given the title of empress. However, I usually like to call her Myeongsung because that's what Koreans call her today. The reason this ends, in a sense, Japan's power is not just international pressure, not just because it makes Japan look bad on the world stage. King Kojong will actually flee to the Russian Legation. This frightens him. The Japanese have killed his queen. If he doesn't do something, they may kill him next. So the Protestant missionaries actually help break him out of the palace, where he's basically being held hostage by the Japanese. And in a sense, in this time period, whoever controls the king controls Korea. They're going to help the Protestant missionaries are going to help the king escape to the Russian Legation, which now gives Russia a lot of influence. Right? In Korean political theory at this time, sovereignty flows from the king. So if you can control the king, in a sense, you control the country. Right? The king is the legal sovereign. If whatever he says is what goes. So now, because the Japanese frighten the Korean king by killing his queen, he flees to the Russian Legation, which is basically like the embassy. It's like a building that is where the Russians have their diplomats, and is considered basically Russian territory. So that they can't, no one can go in there and force them to give up the king. And the king is going to basically take refuge there. This will humiliate Japan, and it will force Japan to withdraw much of its influence from Korea. And Japan and Russia will actually sign what's called the Moscow Protocol, both agreeing to recognize Korean independence. Popular pressure will then eventually lead the king to return to his own palace, as well as some Russian diplomatic mistakes. It's a long story. It's very complex. I won't get into. But even though the Russians control the king, they have a diplomat who kind of makes some mistakes, and that gives the king an excuse to leave the Russian legation and return to his own palace. And because of the weakness of the king, right? Think about this. The poor Korean kingdom is so weak, it can't even protect its king and queen, especially the queen who gets assassinated. So many Koreans outside the government start saying, we need to be active. We need to do something to protect our country. And you can see here the rising sense of nationalism, right? We need to do something to protect our country. We need to be active and do something to protect it. And I think a good example to show you of that is what's called the Independence Club, right? It's called the Independence Club. In fact, when I talked about the popular pressure helping play a role in getting the Korean king to leave the Russian legation, the organization encouraging this public pressure was the Independence Club. So among Korean people, even outside the government, there's a growing sense of nationalism, that whatever happens to Korea impacts all Koreans, and therefore Koreans need to be willing to actively work for the good of their government. And many of these nationalists, these Koreans who are interested in the fate of their country, they want radical reform. They want change. They want to make Korea a very different kind of country. And it's interesting because they're not looking to Japan, they're not looking to China, many of them are looking to the United States. Many of them are Protestant Christians converted by these American Protestant missionaries. There were also British Protestant missionaries as well. And they want to make Korea look more like the United States, which is a little bit dangerous because, of course, the United States doesn't have a king. But in any case, they will establish a newspaper called The Independent. And you can see they're influenced by the United States as well as Great Britain because they don't only publish this newspaper in Hangul. Notice they don't publish in Chinese, they publish in Hangul. It's also published in English. And in this newspaper, they will call constantly for modern reform. They will call constantly for Korea to become a truly strong and independent country. And one thing they do is they actually have the gate where the Korean king used to pay his respects to the Chinese ambassador or envoy we talked about. They have a new gate put up called Independence Gate, which is still in Korea. You can go visit it today. And that's one of the first things they do, right, is kind of a symbol of Korea's independence. And this isn't simply building monuments. I mean, this is meant to inspire people. But also, like I said, they use their growing organizational skills. This is a pretty large and growing organization. And they're able to use this to bring public pressure to bear. So they're going to be key to convincing, to getting public opinion to support the return of the king from the Russian Legation in 1897. Right, so you have this organization, mostly people outside the government who want to make Korea strong, who want radical reform, who would like to make Korea more like the United States, which is kind of dangerous. None of them will publicly say, let's get rid of the king, and most want to keep the king around, but they would kind of like to make the king more like the British king, like a constitutional monarch who isn't actually that powerful. And so what happens is, initially the king supports them because they are so, like I said, nationalistic, and they're willing to help him out and support causes he believes in, but eventually he will crush them. Right? The Korean king, Kojong, will order the crushing of the Independence Club in the late 1890s because he, I think correctly in a sense, sees them as a threat to his own power. Right? The Independence Club, even if they don't want a full-scale republic, would like more democracy, would like a constitutional monarch perhaps, and that's not what the Korean king wants, right? So he will eventually crush this organization. So we now have this interesting period in Korean history, a period of state reform. Korea, because Japan and Russia have now been pushed out because China was so decisively defeated that it's going to have its own problems, and we'll talk more about those later, Korea actually enjoys a good amount of independence. And what's interesting is early on in this period, Kojong will declare himself as emperor, right? And this seems absurd in a sense because Korea doesn't have an empire, for one thing, but also Korea just is in a really weak state, right? Japan and China just fought a war over who got to control it without consulting the Koreans. And this war was fought on Korean soil without the Koreans giving their permission. So Korea is extraordinarily weak. In fact, it was so weak it couldn't protect the king or his queen. So it seems kind of absurd that Kojong would declare himself as emperor. Well, the reason Kojong does that is because now he wants to assert Korea's independence. And if Japan has an emperor and China has an emperor, then Korea also needs an emperor. And this represents him rejecting that whole Sino-centric world order. Korea is no longer a country that recognizes China as its older brother. We are an independent country. Right? So in many ways, this is why he was willing to support the nationalists to a certain extent, because he wanted to emphasize Korea's independence. What made him a little bit different is that he wanted a government centralized as an absolute monarchy. He didn't want a legislature. He didn't want a constitution telling him what to do. Right? He didn't want those things. He wanted an absolute monarchy in which he called the shots. Right? That's what he wanted. And this represents an important aspect of his perspective. From his perspective, he puts the fate of the dynasty, that is the ruling family of Korea, on the same level of the nation state, and argues that they're the same thing. He argues that what is good for the dynasty is good for the nation state. Whatever makes me more powerful as a ruler makes the country more powerful. Right? That's his perspective. That's why he doesn't really trust democracy, right? It's hard for him to imagine a Korea that is not centered on the dynasty, on the royal family. And he kind of conflates these two. He sees what's good for him and his power as good for the nation state. And in his defense, his belief is that you need a strong centralized state to undertake state-sponsored reform, right? You need a centralized state with a powerful monarch if you're going to engage in state-sponsored reform. And he does engage in modernizing reforms, right? I've made a big deal in this class about how people dress is important. Look how Kojong is dressed. He's not as striking of a figure as perhaps the Meiji emperor, because he's quite a bit older in this time period. But he is presenting himself as a modernized Western monarch. So he is serious about reform. There are some problems with his reforms. First of all, as I just mentioned earlier, absolute monarchy is, of course, not the way to go. Democracy, it would probably make you more strong. That's what Japan did, right? So he's not trying to follow a Japanese model. He actually seems to be following something like a modern Chinese or Russian model, which isn't going to give strength like the Japanese model will, as we shall see. So that's one problem. But two other problems is the Korean government just does not have the money. In order to modernize, they need lots of money, and they need time to develop their resources so they can get their money. And the problem is they have neither. Right? They're only going to have about 7 years between 1897 and 1904 to try and modernize and make a strong, independent country. That's not nearly enough time to get the resources together to develop their economy so that they can engage in that modernization process. And as I've already alluded to, what makes it so that there's not time is the Russo-Japanese War. There's now going to be another war over who gets to control Korea, and you can see that people in this time period clearly understood this. As you can see, this poor Korean man, in a much more sympathetic, in a sense, view, is being caught between Japan and Russia. Right? So we're going to have another war, this time between Japan and Russia, over who will control Korea. So what leads to this war? Well, the key thing that leads to this war is Russian expansion into East Asia. Right? The Russians are going to expand into East Asia. You may recall the Triple Intervention. That was when Germany and France, led by Russia, used their navies to pressure Japan into returning the Liaodong Peninsula to China following the Sino-Japanese War. At the time, the Russians said it is bad for peace in the East. It threatens peace in the East if China should lose this territory. And then 3 years later, in 1898, the Russians will lease that very same territory from China that they claimed that if Japan was to get a hold of it, would harm peace in the East. this gives you a sense of how Japan felt humiliated and of how the Russians looked at Japan, right? They did not take Japan seriously, right? They did not see Japan as a threat at all, and so were willing to treat it in this insulting way, to say, oh yeah, it's bad for peace that the Japanese have it. Well, if we have it, though, it's quite all right. In addition, the Russians were expanding the Trans-Siberian Railway. They were in the process of building it. It wasn't complete, but when it was complete, it would completely connect the European part of the Russian Empire with the Asian part of the Russian Empire. And that would allow Russia to move troops, to move merchants, to move goods, to move resources, and to basically expand its power further into Asia, making Russia stronger and able to project power into Asia. In addition, during the Boxer Rebellion, we'll talk more about this later, this was a Chinese anti-foreign rebellion. The Boxers will threaten Russian railways near China, and or I should say in Manchuria, which is, I say near China because Manchuria, even though it's a part of China, in this period it was kind of up for grabs. Some people were trying to take it away from China. The Boxers will threaten the Russian railway in Manchuria, so the Russians will put troops there, but when the Boxer Rebellion ends, rather than withdrawing those troops, the Russians will send more troops. So it's clear that the Russians want to expand into Manchuria. They're already actually in Manchuria. They want to expand even further in. And it's very clear that they even want to expand into Korea. And the Japanese consistently tell the Russians diplomatically that they are very concerned about this expansion, that they consider this expansion a threat to their very security. And the Russians don't care. They just look down on the Japanese. The Russian Tsar, I believe, actually will refer to the Japanese as monkeys in his letters. They don't take the Japanese or their concerns seriously. So the Japanese, after exhausting their diplomatic overtures, will launch a surprise attack against the Russians. And I have surprise in quotation marks to note two things. First of all, during this time period, launching a surprise attack was not illegal. And also what the Japanese did, it was kind of clever in a sense, was they timed it so their diplomat declared war on the Russians in Europe, and then they attacked the Russian forces in Asia before the Russian forces in Asia were contacted by the Russians in Moscow in Europe. They didn't realize yet that they were at war, right? So the Japanese declared war properly in a sense, but they just didn't but there wasn't time for the Russians in Europe to let the Russians in Asia know that they were now at war. And like I said before, this is very important because that the Japanese have an alliance with the British at this point, because it's going to mean that the Russians have to fight this alone. They can't call in the French or any of their other buddies for support, because then the British will intervene. Now this is very dangerous. Japan is throwing the dice here. Russia, like China, is much bigger than Japan, has more people, more resources, a bigger army, and a bigger navy. And so the Japanese are really taking an awful chance. And no one thought the Japanese would win this war almost. Even the Japanese weren't sure. But they felt that if they were not to take action, Russia would just continue to expand its power and would become even harder to defeat tomorrow. Right? Once those Russians get that railway complete, they'll be even more powerful. So we Japanese need to fight them now. We need to throw the dice, and hopefully we will win. And as an indication of their victories, that's the Russian Tsar in that woodblock dreaming of his forces that are going to be destroyed by the Japanese. Now, the worst nightmares of the Tsar would come true. He's going to be defeated by this group of people who many Russians would deride as monkeys. And this is shocking, because this is the first time in modern history that a white European power is defeated by an Asian power. Now, why did this happen? Well, the Japanese Army and Navy are still going to perform very well. So it's similar to the Sino-Japanese War. All that stuff I said about the Japanese Army and Navy during the Sino-Japanese War is basically the same with the Russo-Japanese War for our purposes. In addition, the Japanese, as with in the Sino-Japanese War, are going to win a lot of victories. They will almost constantly defeat the Russians, and the Russians will become tired, right? They're just going to become tired and sick of just always losing all the time. In addition, we have to remember that the Russians had to move troops from Europe to Asia. They had to do this using a railway that was not complete. Remember, the Trans-Siberian Railway was not finished. That's why the Japanese wanted to go ahead and attack. And also, the Russians had to move supplies, food, ammunition, shoes, all that stuff had to be brought by railway or other means from Europe to Asia. And there are images that are really striking of Russian soldiers without shoes. And you're in a bad situation when you can't even make sure your soldiers have shoes. In addition, because of the relative weakness of the Russian government, Russian people will also become sick and tired of all these losses and will actually launch an attempted revolution against the Russian government. And so the Russian government is going to say, wow, we need to really focus on our domestic issues. And so what will happen then is that Russia and Japan will end up entering into peace talks with the United States as the intermediary. Teddy Roosevelt will actually be the main negotiator of these peace talks, or I should say main mediator of these peace talks. So that's why that image on the right, you have him standing between Japan and Russia. And what's really fascinating about this is, in many ways, Teddy Roosevelt was actually really pro-Japanese. He didn't much like the Russians, whereas he saw the Japanese as, in a sense, the wave of the future. He saw them as progressive people who would become a powerful nation and that was just more modern, more civilized than the Russians. And I think that's very interesting. It didn't hurt either that he was really into judo, which is a Japanese martial art. And the Japanese knew this, and in order to curry favor with him, actually sent like a really talented judo instructor to instruct him, which I think is interesting. But Japan will win this war, and we'll talk more about the treaty shortly. And it will be understood as the victor. Even though they entered into a negotiated peace, the Japanese don't conquer and threaten Russia in the way they did China, right? Japan's troops could have taken Beijing during the Sino-Japanese War, but there was no question of the Japanese taking Moscow or anything like that in this war. So they don't conquer in the same way, but they do win in this negotiated peace. And many Asians are going to be really inspired by this, including Chinese people, because they say, look, a white power was defeated by a yellow power, and this is the language they're using at the time, right? This kind of racial language based on color terms. And what's fascinating is this is going to lead thousands of Chinese students to flock to Japan to learn about how Japan was able to successfully modernize. Now, looking at the treaty itself, the Japanese will get the Russian railway in southern Manchuria. And that's really a big deal because, as I've mentioned before, railways allow you to expand your power and influence because you can move troops, you can engage in trade, you can move settlers and things like that. The Japanese would also get to control Port Arthur, that area in the Liaodong Peninsula. And the Japanese will refer to this as Kwantung, but it's basically that same general area. Remember that area where they had initially taken from the Chinese, then the Russians forced to give back. Japan will now finally get. The Russian soldiers are going to have to leave Manchuria, so that will remove much Russian influence from there. And Japan will even get the southern half of Sakhalin, which is an island near Japan. However, the Russians will not pay an indemnity to Japan. Japan never threatened the Russian capital. They had not decisively defeated the Russians in its European territory, and they had no chance of doing that. So the Japanese will not be receiving any money from the Russians. And this makes the Japanese people very upset because they were taxed very heavily in order to help pay for this war. And they expected that they would get an indemnity that would make it so they could, get their money back in a sense. And it didn't help that the Japanese government was not completely honest with its people and made it seem like it was doing better than it was and that it had more resources and it had the capability to continue the war when it really couldn't. Of course, it wouldn't make sense to broadcast that. You wouldn't want the Russians to know that. But when the Japanese people who thought that everything was just going great saw the treaty and saw that there was no indemnity, they were so upset that there were massive riots in Tokyo. But in any case, despite that, Japan is the winner, and key for our purposes is Russia will recognize Japan's claims in Korea. They will recognize that Korea has a preponderant amount of interest, Japan has a preponderant amount of interest in Korea. Right, so Russia will officially recognize Japan's claims in Korea. China has basically been pushed aside, and so now Japan has a the way is open for Japan to expand its influence over Korea.